What is up, you awesome people? Gamer Eddie here, and when it comes to Nintendo consoles, I cherish Nintendo consoles. So today, I'm going to be ranking them from worst to best. There's going to be some models I will not include because they're almost as the same as some other models. And I will also be grouping certain models and systems together because there's almost no difference. But with that out of the way, let's get down to the list. Number 25, Virtual Boy. This should be no surprise that this is my least favorite console. The Virtual Boy didn't even last long on the shelves. Heck, it's Nintendo's most unsuccessful console. And with the Virtual Boy, the games were garbage. It wasn't actual 3D virtual stuff. And that's not to mention the red and black colors gave people headaches a lot. This is a system which I wish I never knew about. Number 24, Game Boy Micro. The Game Boy Micro is a sorry excuse for a Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Micro, it's a Game Boy Advance but with a tinier screen and no backwards compatibility. And if you have big hands, this could really be uncomfortable. Number 23, Wii Mini. Do you remember about this console existing? Because I sure don't, and thank goodness, because the Wii Mini is basically a Wii with less storage, no SD card slot, and no backwards compatibility. The only good thing about it is that you could basically load a disc by popping up the top or whatever, but who cares? Number 22, Famicom Classic. Now, I never really played an actual Famicom or Super Famicom, as those are Japanese exclusives, and that includes the Famicom Classic. If you know more about these systems, you would probably love the system a bit more. All I can say on it is, it has a good selection of games. Number 21, Famicom, where it almost all started, technically speaking. No, this is where it started. The Famicom was a Japanese exclusive and even had a disk drive system attachment for it called the Famicom Disk System. Now, I would say more about the Famicom, but like I said, this is a Japanese exclusive console. Number 20, Super Famicom. Straight from the Famicom to the Super Famicom. The Super Famicom I do see better as the regular Famicom because of the broadcast to Teleview attachment, which is no longer in service, and that's kind of disappointing. It was also a Japanese exclusive thing, so there's that. Not much to say on the Super Famicom. Number 19, Super Famicom Classic. Yep, it's basically a miniature version of the Super Famicom, but with different games. I don't know what to say on it, so... Number 18, the Wii U. Now, the Wii U, I will give credit for its good library. That's it. It was underpowered, it had little to no good indie games, and that's not to mention it was running on discs once more, which wasn't too bad, if it wasn't for the fact that most of the games required the gamepad. If it wasn't for that, that would have been okay. And I think the name is also what ruined the selling point of the Wii U. Number 17, Game Boy/Game Boy Pocket. I'm including the Pocket variation with this one, but the Game Boy was the first Nintendo handheld. So you gotta think, this was very primitive with the green and black colors, or gray and black if you owned a Game Boy Pocket. But the main thing wasn't really the screen crunch or anything. No, the main problem with that, there was no backlit screen. The games were decent, but maybe that was about it. Actually, this set was home to a lot of good games, including Tetris and Super Mario Land. Number 16, Game Boy Lite. This is technically the best version of the original Game Boy. Despite being Japanese exclusive, it had a little thing where you can turn on a backlight. And now you can see what games you're playing more clearly. I mean, the Game Boy Pocket, and Game Boy Lite can all be interchanged based on preference. Number 15, Nintendo Entertainment System. This is where America first started with their Nintendo consoles, and Nintendo Entertainment System isn't really too bad. Now, was the games kind of weird? Yeah. Were some of the games trash? If we're talking about LJN games, then yeah. Was there some good classics on there? I mean, Mario Bros, Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Kirby's Adventure. I mean, you really can't go wrong. But this is a console that could have done better if it wasn't for its bulky size, plus the controllers being a bit more cornery. I prefer the dog bone controllers of like a bunch of other different consoles. Number 14, NES Top Loader. Now, there's also a variation out there called the Famicom Junior, or no, not Famicom Junior, Famicom AV. And what it basically is, the NES Top Loader, It's an NES without the signal light, and if you have the NES variant, there's no AV cabling. The good part about it, the top loader, is that there was no region locking, meaning you can play any game from anywhere, I guess almost any time. Yep. Number 13, Game Boy Color. This is basically the newer generation of Game Boy, but it's not the newest generation of Game Boy. Game Boy Color was basically the Game Boy with color, although there was still no backlit screen. But there were still a lot of good games, like the Pokemon series, and a bunch of others out there, which I can't even think of. The Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Ages, and Oracle of Seasons, Link's Awakening DX. It's great, but should have done way better. Number 12, Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System, as it's fully called. The Super Nintendo, I will say this, was a great console. 16-bit wise, it was great. I'm not going to say it's better than the Genesis, although I barely played into the Genesis library. But for Super Nintendo, I mean, you got Super Mario World, Link to the Past, Super Metroid, and this was a decent console. The only problem is that there was no online compatibility like the Super Famicom was. Number 11, Super Nintendo Classic. Now, the SNES Classic, well, is a compilation of a bunch of different Super Nintendo games like Earthbound, Mario World, Link to the Past, and even an unreleased game of Star Fox 2. Releasing a game 20 years after the launch of the console is insane. And that's all I can really say much about it. Number 10, NES Classic. The NES Classic, in my opinion, is a slight bit better than the Super Nintendo one, because there's 10 more games compared to the usual 20, there's 30. All I can really say on it is, it's a good selection of games, and there's even save states, like with the Super Nintendo Classic. Number 9, 2DS/new 2DS XL. I've actually owned a 2DS, and in all honesty, it could have been better. Now, the original 2DS had no opening and closing with it, so the clamshell could easily break. And the main thing is that they got rid of the 3D, which, if you ask me, makes no sense. Although it was still backwards compatible with DS games and could play almost the whole 3DS library. Number 8, DS/DS Lite. Now, I've owned a DS Lite and a DSi. The DS Lite and DS have backwards compatibility with a Game Boy Advance, not Game Boy Color, but they also had a decent amount of games. I mean, the hardware itself wasn't too much. I mean, PictoChat was fun, but that was about it. Number 7, DSi/DSi XL. Now, this is something I'm more familiar with. I remember getting this for my 9th birthday. But the main thing about the DSi and DSi XL, their main flaw is getting rid of backwards compatibility. Their up points really heavily outweigh their flaws, because the pros of having a camera, a little writing note studio, a sound recording studio, an eShop which is no longer running, it was amazing. And there was even certain games that was exclusive with the DSi, which I don't know any DSi exclusive games off the top of my head. Number 6, GameCube. This is what I call a cube of justice, my friends. The GameCube didn't do as good as the PlayStation 2 or OG Xbox, mainly because the games were running on tiny discs instead of regular, which means less storage. But I mean, it's also home to a lot of classic games like, Super Mario Sunshine, Smash Bros. Melee, the list could go on and on. And that ain't even to mention, there was an attachment for the GameCube to where you can play your Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games. And if you ask me, the GameCube, in my opinion, is one of the most backwards compatible Nintendo systems ever. Number 5, Game Boy Advance/Game Boy Advance SP. Now, the Game Boy Advance didn't have a backlit screen while the GBA SP did, so I'm just going to go over it a little bit more. The Game Boy Advance was the last generation of Game Boy consoles, or handhelds, and the games were in 32-bit, similar to 16-bit, but I guess brighter colors, if that makes any sense, and a bit 3D-ish. I mean, you had classics on there, like the Super Mario Advance series, Mario Party Advance, the Four Swords game on the Game Boy Advance, and Pokemon. All those games made the Game Boy Advance what it is today. And it's really hard not to say anything on it, because the Game Boy Advance shaped a lot of people's generations, as this thing was released in the same year as the GameCube, 2001. Number 4, 3DS, 3DS XL, new 3DS, and new 3DS XL. Yeah, Nintendo ain't creative with their console names, but I will give them credit, because the 3DS was not only backwards compatible with DS games, there's also games that utilize 3D. Was the 3D useful in a lot of them? No. No, it wasn't. Was it a fun gimmick? Maybe. Just maybe. But the 3DS also had a Nintendo eShop as well, which is no longer running. There was also other things like Face Raiders, the recording studio, and a few other things out there. And Street Pass, oh boy, I remember Street Pass like it was yesterday. Number 3, Nintendo 64. Now, I didn't want to put this console at number 1 because I want to avoid being biased, as Nintendo 64 is one of my favorite consoles. Of course, it's not one of the best consoles out there. I do love the collection of games it has, even though the controller was complete garbage. But Nintendo 64 was a fun time. You even had a little expansion pack for games like Perfect Dark, Donkey Kong 64, and Majora's Mask. It's all fun if you think about it, but it could have done so much better in the competition too. Number 2, Wii. Now, I like the Wii because, well, motion controls, like, yeah, it means nothing now these days, but so many classic games on there too. Wii Sports Resort, Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, Sonic and the Secret Rings, Sonic and the Black Knight, Mario Galaxy 1 and 2. Like, the Wii was great, and there was great attachments for it too, like the Wii Balance Board and the Wii Motion Plus, which made games a bit more playable. And number 1, Nintendo Switch. I love the Nintendo Switch. Great gaming collection, great indie games. The controllers are quite creative. The HD rumble is actually responsive. I mean, I could go on and on all day about the Nintendo Switch. And there's also Nintendo Switch Online, which allows you to play games from the generations of Nintendo Entertainment System, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, Game Boy Advance, heck, even the Sega Genesis was a software on there. And if you ask me, if it wasn't for the GameCube being more physically backwards compatible, Nintendo Switch is definitely the most digitally backwards compatible gaming system out there. Thank you guys for joining me today. Make sure you like, subscribe, and comment down below and tell me what I should do next time. Other than that, this is Gamer Eddie. Peace.